Welcome everybody to our last School of Environment and Natural Resources seminar for this semester. So we're very lucky again to co-sponsor this event with the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and I'll turn it over in 1 second to them, but we really appreciate their collaboration on this seminar and our previous seminar. So today's seminar will actually be a panel discussion, environmental impact of overpopulation, author meets critics, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Piers Turner. So thank you very much again for partnering with us.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Scott, and also Saeed, and everyone at the School of Environment and Natural Resources. We really appreciate the partnership and hope we can continue it in the future. So I'm going to introduce the panel today and then hand things over. It's an author meets critics panel focused on a new book by Trevor Hedberg titled The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation, which is available from Routledge Press for anybody who is interested in buying it at the end. I'll make that little plug on Trevor's behalf. We're really pleased not only to welcome Trevor himself today, but two other experts in environmental ethics and the ethics of procreation. So let me just introduce them each in turn. Trevor Hedberg himself is a postdoctoral scholar here at Ohio State in a joint position between the College of Pharmacy and the Center for Ethics and Human Values. Already at this early stage in his career, he's published widely in applied ethics, especially environmental ethics and other fields, and we're lucky to have him here. Our first commentator will be Ramona Ilea. She's professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at Pacific University near Portland, Oregon. A leader in the field of public and engaged philosophy, I encourage you all to visit engagedphilosophy.com. Ramona has published numerous articles on environmental ethics, especially on animal ethics, and on civic engagement in education. After Ramona, we're going to welcome Don Hubin, Professor Emeritus in Ohio State's Department of Philosophy and Director Emeritus of the Center for Ethics and Human Values. Thanks, Don. Don has made important contributions on a number of topics across moral and political philosophy. But for our purposes today, the most relevant part of his work has been as a leading contributor to the ethics of procreation, including on justice and future generations and parental rights. We're thrilled to have all three of them join us. So let me just say a word about format today. We'll start with some remarks about the book's main themes from Trevor. And then those will be followed by comments from Ramona and then Don. Trevor will have an opportunity to respond very briefly, and then we'll open up the panel to questions from the audience in the last 20 minutes or so. And questions could be addressed to any or all of the panelists. To submit a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. At the bottom of the Zoom screen, if you scroll your cursor down, you'll see it. And you do not need to wait till the end to submit a question. We'll start trying to queue them up and grouping them together before then. Okay, so with that, well, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Trevor.
Thanks, Piers, and let me extend my thanks to everyone behind the scenes for the Center of Ethics and Human Values and the School of Environment and Natural Resources for making this event happen. And especially thanks to Don and Ramona for joining me virtually for what I think is a conversation about a really important and sadly somewhat neglected topic. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little screen sharing here, get the PowerPoint up and running. And you don't need my presenter view. All right. So I'm going to basically just try to do a couple of things with the time I've got here. Since I only have 15 minutes and it's a 200-page book, I'm going to hit a few of the main highlights and say a little bit about the motivation for writing the book and try to lay out in most detail the actual policy proposals that I defend in the book, because that's always, and I've presented on this topic in the past, what people wonder about the most. So I want to start with just a simple equation, a way to sort of conceptualize and understand the problem. When you're looking at total environmental impact of any particular population, you can break it down into impact per capita or average impact per person and multiply that by the population. And if you look at the trends in environmental ethics over the last few decades, overwhelmingly, the focus has been on the impact per capita variable, or in other words, the environmentally destructive behaviors that people are engaged in, and in particular, the behaviors of people in the developed world. And what I was wondering about 5-6 years ago, when this question when this issue sort of first came onto my radar screen, was, well, it seems like we're having a really hard time doing what we ought to be doing when it comes to reducing our impact per capita, or our, changing our behaviors in ways that are more environmentally friendly. Could we make any progress on the human numbers part of this equation, where we have lots and lots of people who are engaging in these kinds of behaviors in various ways and causing these various environmental impacts? So right now in 2020, we've got 7.8 billion people in the world. By 2100, most estimates put us at about 10.9 billion. There's a little bit of variation. That's the median scenario, the most likely scenario, according to the UN's projections. So here's like what that kind of looks like. One of the reasons why I think people are kind of prone to dismiss the human numbers question is because they look at this orange line, which represents the population growth rate. And I should mention, I live near train tracks. And so if you hear like train engine at some point, that's what it is. Can't do anything about it. It's coronavirus. We're working from home. This is how it goes. So anyway, population growth rate is this orange line. And it's been, since it peaked close to 1970, steadily going down over time. And people look at this and they say, well, look at how little the growth rate is. It's only 1% here near the year 2020. The problem is there's 7.8 billion people in the world. So 1% growth rate means that in that year, we're going to add 78 million people. And so at 7.8 billion, adding 78 million people a year means, 3 years from now, we'll be over 8 billion. So there is some good news here, that we're starting to level out, as you can see from the projection, but it's still taking time. And the range at where we could end up, according to the UN's, confidence interval, varies a little bit. Generally centers around 11 billion, could be a little bit lower. Their sort of low fertility scenario, which is the bottom of this curve, would put us actually under 10 billion in 2100, and we would peak somewhere between 9 and 10, maybe in 2075, 2080, something like that. The high fertility scenario looks disastrous because we're not even approaching like stabilization, and we'd be like, 13 billion or something like that in 2100. So that's kind of where things stand on the global picture. You might wonder, why exactly is population growth such a bad thing? And the short answer is, well, it's not bad in itself. It's not bad like intrinsically. It's bad because of how it contributes to other things that are going on. So the idea is, if you have one person doing something bad, that may be however bad, but if you have 2 people, it's twice as bad. If you have 100 people, it's 100 times as bad. And so we have lots of environmental problems that currently exist that are being made worse by having lots and lots of people engaging in them. Now, these are not the only things to which population growth contributes, not the only problems, but these are the ones that I put the most emphasis on in the introductory portions of the book. Food shortages, freshwater shortages, species extinctions, and contributions to climate change. We know when it comes to food shortages that we're going to see a significant rise in global food demand between now and 2050. Some estimates put it, compared to like levels in 2010, I've seen some estimates put the increase at 70% above that level. As there is some variance in the estimates, some people are even more dire than that. I've seen some experts saying that by 2030, we will no longer be able to feed everybody in the world, even if the food was distributed optimally. That's driven by an increasing demand for meat, which is much more costly to produce. It just takes more resources to produce a pound of meat than a pound of vegetables. And as people develop, they want more meat. But it's also driven in part by just the fact that we're going to have more mouths to feed as time goes on. Freshwater shortages will be exacerbated in part by climate change, which is also on this list, but also, again, just by the fact that there will be more people in various regions of the world who have a need for fresh water. Species extinctions, some conservation biologists have already basically argued that we're in the midst of a 6th mass extinction, that the rate of extinction is so massive compared to the background extinction rate that it constitutes a really serious ecological crisis. This one's particularly worrisome because it takes millions of years for biodiversity to recover from mass extinction events. So if in fact this is the sixth mass extinction, and it does play out that way, we're not, like, none of us and none of our descendants are going to see any biodiversity recovery on the scale that the loss takes place. And biodiversity is typically associated with providing a lot of valuable ecosystem services to people, providing resources that we can't easily create for ourselves. A lot of people think biodiversity has aesthetic value, that it's a valuable source of knowledge about the world. Lots of reasons why people care about biodiversity, and that also doesn't even broach the possibility that you might view the species that are going extinct as having a sort of intrinsic value, as being valuable for their own sake, independent of their usefulness to people. And climate change is probably the biggest one. This is the one I definitely spent the most time on in the book. It looms the largest, in part because it is a global problem that is coming upon us very, very quickly. The window to adequately respond to climate change is rapidly shortening. So that's part of why I think looking at the population variable in this equation is so important, because the longer you wait to respond to climate change, the more the steeper the reduction in carbon emitting activities has to be. And given the long-term impacts of climate change with respect to more severe weather events, sea level rise, and the way it contributes to the other three items on this list, it's not the kind of thing that can be ignored. So everyone agrees in discussing this stuff that reducing impact per capita is a big part of the solution to our environmental problems. Like, we got to change our behaviors, we got to make transitions to sustainable ways of living, renewable energy, that sort of thing. I'm not disputing any of that. The problem is progress in that direction has been so slow and is so fraught with difficulty. I mean, we like the benefits of modernity, and it's really, really hard to get people to shift their entire lifestyle in a different direction in such an abrupt way. So there's a problem there. And there's also this broader question about long-term sustainability, which is, even if we were able to do that, would it be possible, even under idealized conditions, to live sustainably with a global population in 2100 of about 11 billion people? And many people think the answer is no. To just give one example, an estimate from the Global Footprint Network said if everybody in the world wants to live at the same level of affluence as someone in Western Europe, which would be significantly more than the global average, as it were, right now, but significantly less environmentally impactful than a standard American citizen, we would still have to lower global population to about 2 billion people if every single person on the planet was going to live that way, and if it were going to be sustainable for the long term, for an indefinite period of time using the resources we have on the planet. Some people put the estimate even lower than that at like 1 billion or 1.5 billion. I've seen estimates as high as 3 billion. I don't have a stake in who's right. Either way, we would have to significantly reduce our current numbers. This is just a graphical illustration of what I was talking about with climate change, just to give you one kind of concrete example. This data was current as of a couple of years ago, but I'm sure that coronavirus has shifted the sort of projections. This is designed to illustrate that the more rapid, the longer you wait to do something about climate change, the more rapid your cuts have to be in terms of your carbon emissions if you're trying to meet the 2 degrees Celsius threshold that's part of the Paris Agreement, right? So if we actually wanted to keep the rise in global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, we would have to do a lot very, very quickly. We'd have to half our carbon emissions by 2030, half them again by 2040, and half them again by 2050. I just think that's completely undoable, especially in the context of an ever-rising population and of people who want to continue living in these affluent sort of ways. So the main proposal behind the book is maybe instead of working to reduce rates of environmentally harmful consumption exclusively, maybe we should try to do both. Maybe we should also try to stabilize and in the long term reduce global population. So I'm going to run through these real quick because these are, because I want to get to the policies in the time I've got. Some people are reluctant to discuss population at all because they remember the population policies of the past, like the 1960s and 70s, say, which were often characterized by human rights abuses, forced abortions and sterilizations, or had eugenics-based agendas where it was really just the goal was just to make sure that certain people didn't reproduce, rather than actually living up to some kind of goal of ecological sustainability. Thomas Malthus and Paul Ehrlich in the past made some inaccurate claims about the relationship between population growth and food production, predicting mass starvation, and they were wrong. So some people have kind of hastily generalized that, oh, well, population must not really make that big a difference because we'll always have a technological solution to solve the problem. And economists also often associate population growth with economic growth, and if economic growth is all you care about, then that can incentivize you to really want to prioritize population growth. So what a lot of people think about when they are thinking about population policy is they have in mind these sort of one-child policies associated like what was instituted in China, which are extremely coercive and often result in these kinds of abuses and human rights violations. People are not on board with that. The good news is, in no point in the book do I ever endorse using a one-child policy. I think not only it would face significant moral obstacles, but that it would also be objectionable from a practical standpoint. Because I think in a democratic society, if you start entertaining those ideas, you're just going to wind up getting population put back up on the shelf. Because there was a 20-year period from the early 90s to like about 2011, 2012, where there's basically just no discussion of population because it was so politically incorrect to even bring it up in certain contexts. So I'm just going to sort of take that one off the table. There are, however, some other options that we can do that are not only not coercive, but they're actually autonomy enhancing. One of these is increasing access to contraception, just making it easier for people to exercise control over their reproductive choices. Another one is improving sex education. This is something that would be particularly relevant to our situation in the US because we still have lots and lots of states in the US that are teaching abstinence-only sex education. And students who get abstinence-only sex education do not get taught how to use contraception effectively, do not get taught about its importance. And so compared to people who get comprehensive sex education, they have a higher rate of STI contraction and a higher rate of unintended pregnancies. So which are bad for the people involved, independent of anything having to do with population. So giving them better sex education would be sort of a win-win. It would improve their personal lives. It would also improve things from an ecological standpoint. And the other big one we could do is improving environmental education, just making people more aware of the problem. It's a strange phenomenon to me that like a lot of environmental ethics textbooks, for example, have no chapter on population or on its connection to any of the issues that I've sort of mentioned. It's a relative blind spot as far as how we're teaching people. It's also possible there's been some evidence that we can enact some change through media campaigns. So doing things like doing outreach through perhaps social media or television or other forms of mass media to try to improve people's attitudes towards small families, to try to make it more socially acceptable for people to choose to have one child instead or two children instead of 3 or 4, and trying to kind of counteract some of the latent pronatalist biases that linger in a lot of cultural practices. The other one I'll mention is incentivization strategies, which is the one in the book that I'm the least. I'm pretty supportive of media campaigns, increasing access to contraception, improving sex education, and improving environmental education. Incentivization is murkier because really, really harsh negative incentives, which involve punishment, are very hard to distinguish from outright coercion if they are implemented. If you're imposing really, really severe penalties on people who are economically disadvantaged. So positive incentives, maybe those are more doable. So these would be cases where like you're rewarding people for having smaller families. So we could invert the tax system in such a way that you get tax exemptions for having, like, say you start with, you get exemptions for having no children or for having just one child or something like that. Some of those proposals, it's hard to work out the practical details. I think that those would have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis if we were going to go in for those. But I'm more reticent to endorse incentivization schemes than the other items that are, right, in the center or to the right of center on this graph. So that's where these things stand with respect to policy. I have some extra slides in here, like fleshing out the rationales behind them, but I don't have time to go through those. So I'll save those if people have additional Q&A questions. The last thing I do want to mention real quick is that before I turn it over to Ramona for comments is that my overall view on like how many people you should have, if from a standpoint of just individual procreation, independent of the policy question, is basically a view that could be described as max of 2. You can have up to 2 biological children under certain conditions, though I do think it's hard to meet that justificatory burden, but I'm not advocating for like an antinatalist position where I think no one should have any kids, which is a view that I have a whole chapter on that view in the book, even though like very few people outside of those corrupted by philosophy hold it. But I do think that you can't really provide a justification for having 3 or more children under current conditions. So that wraps up what I have to say as these sort of introductory remarks. So Ramona and Don are both going to kind of take aim at the individual procreative like view. So I'll flesh that out more in my later remarks based on what they say. So take it away, Ramona.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you to everyone who played a role in organizing this session. I am really excited to be part of it. In addition to my usual teaching roles and other roles that I play in society, I am the general editor of a journal called Essays in Philosophy. And a few years ago, I was struck by how little discussion there was of morality of choosing to have children. So I put out a call for papers for the journal on that topic. As Trevor points out, it seemed like this topic had been taboo for a really long time. And I was really excited to see what kind of work philosophers might be doing on that topic. Trevor published a paper in that journal, which is really excellent, and it's open source, open access. So I would recommend people checking it out. Again, it's in Essays on Philosophy. But then he released this book, and I was really excited to see it. And when I read it, I thought it was an excellent book. It's really well written. It's really, really well researched. Trevor presents an impressive amount of information, empirical information, as you could see from his presentation today and his slides. There's a lot of really awesome information there, reliable, trustworthy sources, and his arguments are grounded in the philosophical literature and showcase a really amazing ability, in my opinion, to present this information in a very clear way, in a way that's clear to everybody, philosophers and non-philosophers alike. So philosophers often have this like terrible talent for presenting information in a way that's kind of obscure or complicated or full of jargon. Trevor doesn't do any of that. So I would really recommend this book. In fact, I would say that Trevor's book is one of the most engaging, clear, and well-organized books that I've ever read. So I would highly recommend it. I would say if you can't afford it or you'd rather not purchase it, you can convince your local library, your public library, your university library to purchase it, and then you can borrow it for free, right? Yeah, highly recommend it. So now that I'm done with these kind of preliminary remarks, I would love to focus on a few questions that I have. So these might be kind of controversial. I'm hoping that they're controversial, right? I focused on questions that would trigger discussion, and I'm hoping that you guys will find them thought-provoking and exciting enough to talk about maybe after this event is over with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues, and so on. Okay, so Trevor, if everyone in this audience today, and I see that we have really amazing turnout, right, 141 people. So all 141 of us are like me and they're convinced of your arguments. What would you recommend that we actually do? So most of us can't create and pass policies, right? So your book is focused a lot on policies that should be passed. But we don't have that kind of power, right? I'm guessing most of us in the audience, maybe some of you guys are super powerful and you can pass policies tomorrow, but I can't, and I know many of us can't. So what could we do instead if we want to kind of make a difference on this topic now that we're persuaded by your arguments? Do you think that we should write to our elected officials to advocate for the policies that you describe in this book? Would you say that that's morally obligatory or just recommended or just like a nice thing to do? So writing to elected officials seems to me like a really good solution. I'm curious if you agree or disagree. Should we write to nonprofits that we're part of, or perhaps if we sit on boards or if we're officers in various nonprofits, should we propose that our nonprofit, especially if it's an environmental nonprofit, try to tackle this issue and persuade them to pay more attention to overpopulation issues? Should we make donations to causes that support decreasing the overall global population or consumption, or especially nonprofits that see that relationship between the two, between consumption and population? So I'm sure a lot of nonprofits would really appreciate our money. And do you think, so again, I'm curious if you think any of these things are kind of morally obligatory or just nice things that we should do, that we should consider doing if we're able, and so on. But also, I would really like to hear more about how you think we can influence family and friends. After all, policies are limited in their ability to affect social change, right? So most Americans' decision to have few children is not caused by a change in federal or even state policy, right? It's not caused by work that nonprofits do, but I think it's mostly caused by habits, by attitudes, and by expectations of those around us, right? So I know from personal experience that many of my friends have ended up having children simply because they were in the habit of using unreliable birth control and they just got pregnant. And it was like, oh, I guess we'll keep the kid and have a kid. It wasn't a totally well thought out decision, right? So it was just a habit of unreliable birth control or unreliably used and so on. In some cases, the habit was simply a habit of thinking of yourself and your future as one that involves having children because that's what's expected, right? And I've had many friends that have been pressured into having children by their families, right? By their parents, by grandparents, and even colleagues and casual friends asking things like, oh, you're married, are you gonna have a kid soon? Or, oh, you have, I was talking yesterday to a friend that has 2 kids, and she was saying she's starting to get questions about when she's gonna have a third. Not if, but when, right? Most people in her neighborhood have 3 or 4, and they're starting to ask her that question, right? And she's feeling like, oh, isn't 2 enough? Should I consider having a third, right? So I think a lot of us, again, are shaped by habits, attitudes, and expectations of those around us. So how can we change that, again, if we're convinced of the arguments that you present in this book? Should everyone try to advertise the advantages of having smaller families or maybe even being child-free? Should, for example, those of us that are child-free and we're happy, should we advertise kind of the advantages of having extra time, extra money, right? Especially in these pandemic times, right? Not having to deal with at-home schooling, not having to deal with kids wanting to see their friends and spreading viruses and so on, right? But even in regular times, right, there are many advantages, as you rightly point out in your book. And I think sometimes people think that having children will actually lead to more happiness, but that's not necessarily the case. So should we publicize these arguments, right? And or should we not? Should we try to inform others of some facts that might persuade them to have fewer kids in subtle or less subtle ways? Should we publicize the arguments that you make in your book to, like, just sharing the information that you shared in this presentation today or in the book in general, to our communities, places of worship, among our family and friends, perhaps in very formal ways, like making a presentation to your place of worship, or maybe just in a very casual kind of non-threatening way, like, hey, I went to this talk and this guy was saying this and that. What do you think about that? Is that a good idea, or is that even perhaps a moral obligation? Should we try to make it more socially acceptable, at least among our family and friends, to talk about birth control, right? I think that's another taboo topic. You don't really talk about birth control with a lot of family, friends, colleagues, students, and so on, right? Perhaps if this was more out in the open, we would talk about more reliable birth control. We would talk about different advantages and disadvantages and so on, and people could have more support system in that area. Should those of us that have friends or should those of us that actually are in the position of putting pressure on others to have children stop doing that, right? So if we're one of those people that's like, hey, when are you going to have a third kid? Should we stop asking those kinds of questions that could be implying something or pressuring somebody? Also, when friends tell us that they're going to have a child, right? I think the polite thing to do is to say, congratulations. And yet that seems like a weird thing to say, right? It always struck me as weird to say, congratulations, you got pregnant. Like, that's weird. Like, what? Congratulations for having unprotected sex. Wow, yay. But especially if we don't think that having children is necessarily an awesome thing for the earth, right? It's like when someone gets an SUV, I don't say, oh, congratulations, you bought an SUV, right? Should I congratulate people or should I say something else, right? Especially if this is their third, fourth, fifth child, right? And conversely, should it be socially acceptable to congratulate people for being child-free or having just one child, right? If somebody says, oh, we decided to just stay, just keep having one child, right? Should we say, oh, wow, awesome, congratulations, what a great decision, right? I don't think that's the norm, right? And I'm not sure if that would be a good norm to have or not. And finally, should those of us that have two or more children, I shouldn't say those of us, I don't have two or more children, but should people that have two or more children be more honest and open about some of the drawbacks rather than just kind of posting the happy moments on Instagram and Facebook, the cute times, the times when the kids are doing awesome, rewarding things? Or should we be more open about the difficulties of having multiple children? And finally, really finally with the questions, should those of us that teach cover the environmental effects of overpopulation in our classes? And should we advocate for this topic to be included in environmental ethics textbooks and conferences? Because as you pointed out, it isn't really. So changing gears a little bit, in your book, as you pointed out, you talk a lot about the policy implications of your proposals. And I think the policy implications are amazing. It's hard for me to disagree with them. You have really, especially the non-coercive ones that are autonomy enhancing, I think are really great policy proposals. But you do have a chapter titled Individual Procreative Obligations. And I think this chapter is really well argued and very thorough, but it felt to me a little bit rushed. So I wonder if you can say more about the times when it's acceptable to have two children, because you do say that that can be acceptable. So just to review your argument just very briefly, right? You talk about, your argument is actually really nuanced and sophisticated, which I really admire, right? So you provide a lot of leeway for times when it's acceptable to have 0, 1, and then maybe 2 children. And you leave a lot of room for context and different circumstances. And I think that's really awesome. And that's not something that is typical in this literature, right? A lot of people, as you said, are antinatalists, or they say only 1 child, or, as many as you want, and so on. So your argument is really beautifully nuanced. But I didn't really understand when it's acceptable to have 2 children. As you point out, having a child increases one's environmental footprint 24 times more than living car-free. So 24 times more than living car-free, one extra child. And many of us environmentalists think that driving is, something that we should try not to do, and we should try to drive as little as possible, right? So how could something that's so much more wasteful be morally justified, especially once a couple has had one child? You do present some reasons in the book, but I didn't feel like those were very strong reasons. I felt like those were reasons where couples might want a second child, but there are lots of things that we want and we're not going to have. Like, I mean, I would love to have a helicopter, I think would be cool, but I'm not going to get a helicopter, right? Some people might love to have multiple cars and just drive all day for fun, but we're not going to do that if we take environmental issues seriously. So I've had a lot of questions and presented a lot of different ideas, and I know you have 5 minutes to respond to me. So I feel like I should probably stop here. I'm sure you're not going to even be able to address all these questions. But I hope, again, to stir some conversation and get people talking about this, about the important contribution that you're making to environmental issues and the discussions about global population. Again, I think everybody should read this book and talk about it with family and friends and coworkers and everybody that you can. So thank you so much again for including me in this panel. I'm really excited to hear the rest of the panel and to pass it on to Dawn now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. Thank you. I could spend a good bit of time extolling the virtues of Trevor's book, clear statements of compelling arguments backed up by a command of the relevant empirical research, presented in a way that invites specialists and non-specialists alike to engage with the reasoning. But I'm a philosopher, and in accordance with the norms of my discipline, which seem to be captured in the maxim, if you don't have anything critical to say, don't say anything at all, I plan to focus on some points with which I take issue. But I don't want this focus to leave the impression that I don't admire Trevor's book. That would be a misimpression. And I should warn you that I'm going to take us more into some theoretical abstract issues. I know from looking at the comments that most people are interested in the practical and applied issues. And I ask you to bear with me while I do this, because the arguments I'm going to consider really do bear on the practical proposals that Trevor makes. What I want to discuss is Trevor's arguments concerning an individual's procreative obligations, the threats to human well-being that lead Trevor to argue for the conclusion that we ought to reduce our current population size will be averted only by collective action of a great many people, and the behavior of a single individual makes little, if any, difference. This raises the vexed problem of what obligations an individual has in such circumstances. In addressing the issue of individual procreative responsibilities, Trevor considers both arguments that are based on one's causal role in the production of effects, both ill and good, and arguments that don't rely on this. It is with respect to the non-causally based arguments that I intend to raise some problems. But before getting to those concerns, I want to say a bit about how Trevor appears to be distinguishing between causally based arguments and non-causally based arguments. And as well, I want to say a few words in support of causally based arguments, because I believe that they have broader application and stronger implications than Trevor appears to think. And I say appears to think because it's quite possible that Trevor and I don't differ on substantive matters, but instead on a rhetorical question about where to put one's emphasis in making these arguments. The way Trevor distinguishes between causally based and non-causally based arguments appears to put in the latter category arguments that it seems to me belong in the former. Explaining why he's unsatisfied with relying on causally based arguments, Trevor says this: the core problem with this line of argument, namely the nebulous causal relationship between a particular act and an actual harmful effect experienced by someone else, is difficult to overcome. For this reason, he pivots to an argument based on a duty not to contribute to harms. He proposes that one's actions can be wrong, quote, even if they are not causally connected to harmful outcomes in the way required for us to say that they cause harm, because they are nonetheless contributing to the causal process that leads to the harm. Now, what we identify as the cause of an outcome and why we do so are vexed questions. I think that in ordinary conversation, when we identify something as the cause of an outcome, or we say that it causes the outcome, I think our thought is contextual. We're picking out some feature that our listener might not recognize as being relevant here. In any case, I would think that the moral duty not to cause harm was not restricted to actions that we would identify as the cause of harm or as simply causing the harm. And to my ear, at least, the notion of contributing to harm, which Trevor employs throughout this section, is a causal notion. Now, Trevor sometimes uses different non-causal language. So, for example, he says, we think that it is morally wrong to play a role, even a causally impotent one, in an ongoing injustice when we can refuse to participate at little cost to ourselves. Now, I'm not sure what it means to say, to play a causally impotent role in an ongoing injustice. But one could, I suppose, play a role in an organization or an institution or a practice that commits injustices and causes harm, and have one's actions be causally impotent in producing the injustice or the harms. But in this case, I'm not so confident of the judgment that the action is wrong. Imagine someone who joins a police force that has a history of unwarranted use of violence against members of a minority group within the community. Our new recruit is committed to racial justice and conducts herself in a way that doesn't contribute to the injustice or harm of the organization. Nevertheless, she's realistic enough to know that the harm and injustice that the department as a whole causes will continue, despite the fact that in all of her professional duties, she acts admirably. Not only does she not engage in unjustified violence or racial discrimination, her actions, both directly and by example, decrease the violence and injustice in the department. But she certainly plays a role in an organization that causes injustice and harm. It seems to me, though, that there is actually a pro tanto moral reason in favor of her actions, a standing reason that there needs to be something that rebuts it in order to make her action wrong. So there's a reason for her to engage in this, even though she's participating in an organization which causes injustice and harm. Now, of course, and this is vitally important, it is often the case that participating in an organization or practice that causes harm or injustice without actively working against those outcomes contributes to the harm or injustice indirectly, merely by showing or appearing to show support for the organization or practice, or by placing oneself in a position where one's criticism of the organization or practice is not taken seriously. But if that's the relevant factor, we're back to talking of a causal story. I think then that I understand the class of causally based arguments to be broader than Trevor does, even if it's inapt to say that one's action causes harm or injustice. The fact that they contribute to harm or injustice provides a causally based pro tanto reason against performing them. In addition to thinking that the class of causally based arguments is broader than Trevor seems to believe, I also think it's more powerful than he seems to believe. I don't think that it matters, for example, that, and this is a quote from Trevor, what happens to our particular emissions can vary rather dramatically. Some of them may stay in the atmosphere, but others may be stored in a natural carbon sink or dissolve in the ocean. In the first place, no one knows what will happen to their own emissions, and so no one knows that their emissions will not contribute to harm. Acting in a morally responsible way requires an appropriate risk-benefit analysis. Secondly, and with the caveat that no one should attempt to learn climate science from me, I'll say that I suspect that even if miraculously all of my emissions were to be trapped in a natural carbon sink, that would have an adverse effect on the environment by reducing that carbon sink's ability to absorb other emissions. And this brings us to indirect causal consequences of our actions, which I think is an especially powerful point when we consider procreative responsibilities. The decision to procreate involves causal responsibility not just for one's immediate offspring, but for one's entire progeny, extending as far in the future as does that progeny. The harms caused by your procreative act are all of the harms, no matter how far in the future, that are caused by any of your progeny. That quantity is, of course, unknowable, but there are reasons to expect it to be quite large. And this leads me to suspect that the causally based arguments for restricting one's procreative actions are more compelling than it might at first appear. Now, given Trevor's practical concerns, he won't be troubled if, when subtle and long-term consequences are considered and when we hold people responsible for the risks of harm that they cause, causally based arguments turn out to be even stronger than they might appear. But Trevor wants also to provide a non-causal argument for limiting one's procreative actions, one based on the moral demand for integrity. And here I have some concerns about his argument. This might sound terrible for a moral philosopher to say, but I've always been a bit skeptical about integrity. To be more specific, I've been skeptical about the idea that there is a direct deontic moral role for integrity. What I mean by a deontic moral role is this: does integrity bear directly on the moral advisability of actions, on their permissibility or impermissibility? If we think of integrity as Trevor explicitly defines it, having a consistent set of beliefs and values and acting in accordance with those values, even in spite of temptation to compromise them, I guess I prefer that Nazis not act with integrity, no matter how consistent their values are. And this isn't, I don't think, because I see the evil of those actions as overriding a pro tanto or standing moral reason to act with integrity. I don't think an agent has any moral reason to act on morally despicable values. There's no pro tanto moral reason to be overcome in this case. This means that I have doubts about the first premise of the integrity argument. The premise states individuals should live with integrity, despite the fact that it sounds terrible to say that. To be clear, I don't deny that integrity has moral significance. A moral theory that denied the moral significance of integrity would, as Trevor asserts in a paper that he's written on the integrity argument, contain a fatal flaw. But I do question whether integrity bears directly on the justification of actions. Trevor contrasts integrity with what he describes as its antithesis, hypocrisy. I don't think this can be quite right. Trevor might be right that hypocrisy doesn't require one's representations to others about one's beliefs and values to harm them, but it certainly does require some representation to others of one's beliefs and values. His definition of integrity, though, says nothing about how one represents oneself to others. One could fail to exhibit integrity by having incoherent beliefs and values, or by not acting on their values, whether or not one makes any representation to others about those values. And as well, one could have consistent beliefs and values and act consistently with one's values, even though one misrepresents one's beliefs and values to others. But this is not where my main concern with the integrity argument lies. My main concern has to do with the premise that Trevor focuses his attention on. If individuals should live with integrity and cooperate in working toward a collective political solution to climate change, then they should reduce their personal greenhouse gas emissions, the crucial premise in the integrity argument. Trevor believes that this is true because our commitments in the political sphere should align with our behavior in the personal sphere. It seems to me, though, that this gives too little attention to the content of the commitment. If the commitment is simply to work to achieve political solutions to global climate change, it would seem that the behavior required in the personal sphere to align with this need say nothing about one's personal greenhouse emissions. That is, unless reducing one's personal greenhouse emissions contributes to achieving a political solution to global climate change, a probability I will return to soon. I take this line of attack to be one that Trevor is familiar with and has offered two responses to in his book. The first response is this. He says, given the role that individual behavior plays in communicating our commitments to others, there is a significant risk that neglecting personal emissions reductions would hinder efforts to realize the desired change. This is an excellent point, and one that has not been missed by those wanting to impugn Al Gore's character by pointing out his less than environmentally frugal lifestyle. Notice first, though, that what's directly relevant to the effect in question is not one's integrity, but one's perceived integrity. Now, it might well be that the most reliable way to appear to have integrity is actually to have it. So Trevor might say, well, it might be possible for someone to maintain the facade of integrity while lacking it. No one can count on that. If so, then having integrity is valuable because it's the most reliable way to present the appearance of having integrity, which itself is valuable because it fosters the achievement of political solutions to climate change. But notice that we are now giving a causally based argument for living with integrity. There seems to be nothing conceptually problematic about such arguments, which is why I said earlier that my doubts about the deontic moral significance of integrity were doubts about its direct deontic significance. Trevor's second response is that the person who adopts a political commitment to aid a collective response to climate change, while also adopting a principle of only performing activities that would actually make a difference towards solving that problem, doesn't exhibit the type of coherence that integrity demands. And he offers 3 cases that are designed to persuade the reader of this. So let's look at them in turn. The first case is of a priest who advocates universal monogamy, but is non-monogamous in his own life. As we fill in the story with our imagination, this certainly sounds hypocritical, and the priest doesn't look like a model of integrity. However, I suspect that's because we import an assumption about the priest's reasons for advocating universal monogamy. We assume, I think, that the priest advocates this because he believes that the violation of the norms of monogamy is either intrinsically immoral or, in the individual case, likely to be unjustifiably harmful. If those are his reasons, I agree he's not acting with integrity. But there could be other reasons for which a person would advocate for the social acceptance of a norm of monogamy. Suppose a person lives in a highly patriarchal society that approves of polygamy. In this society, there are many young men who are unable to find partners, and as a result, they contribute to social unrest. Our critic of this arrangement is himself a high-status male with several wives. Seeing the ill effect of this general practice, he advocates for the establishment of a norm of monogamy. But he doesn't think that any one individual rejecting polygamy makes a difference, and so he doesn't behave monogamously himself. I don't see how this demonstrates a lack of integrity, and it certainly needn't involve hypocrisy. He could be completely open about this. The second case is one of an individual who advocates for people to donate to charity to alleviate suffering, but doesn't do so herself. There is most likely hypocrisy here, though I suppose someone could, at the cost of their effectiveness, be open about it. But there is obviously a benefit coming from one's individual donations, at least there is if one donates wisely. The pro tanto moral reason for donating to alleviate suffering is there quite independently of whether the person advocates for people in general to be generous. I don't see the argument that there's a special moral reason based on the integrity argument. To be sure, it might be very effective argumentatively to point out to the person that she is not practicing what she preaches. Exposure as a hypocrite brings shame and diminishes one's effectiveness. And I agree with Trevor that people, at least many people, strive for a kind of integrity. Cognitive dissonance is disturbing to most people, although alas, it seems not to be disturbing to some. But as I see it, the moral reason for this individual to act in accordance with her professed principles is that those principles are correct. She would have equally strong reasons for acting in accordance with those principles, even if she didn't profess them. The third case is that of an animal rights activist who routinely chows down cheeseburgers. And here my response is similar to the one I give to the stingy advocate of generosity. I used to argue that my own eating of meat didn't have any impact on the number of animals raised and killed under our current inhumane conditions. Unfortunately, over a lunch at an American Philosophical Association meeting that I happened to be sitting across from the distinguished philosopher Alan Gibbard, Professor Gibbard disabused me of this view. He said, in a style that is characteristic of him, halting but brilliantly insightful, I would imagine that the expected number of animals killed because of your consumption would be roughly equal to the number of animals you ate in your life. And the scales fell from my eyes, and I think that this is true. If there were no harm in individual meat eating, if the harm arose only when there was a critical number of people eating meat, I don't see how it lacks integrity or necessarily involves hypocrisy for someone to say, in effect, I'll stop eating meat if we get enough others to do so as well. Remember, though, I take very seriously the causal argument about undermining your goal by being perceived as not having integrity. The point is that it matters not only what the content of our commitment is, as I've already indicated, but what our reasons for advocating change at the social level are. If our reasons are that these acts are intrinsically wrong or individually harmful, then of course it shows lack of integrity to perform them while professing to be against them. But if our reasons have to do only with the collective effect of such actions, I can't see why integrity provides an argument for not engaging in them. This sounds very much like Thomas Hobbes' first law of nature, where he says, roughly, one should seek peace, but if unattainable, use every advantage of war. Now, we're not talking war here, of course, but the structure of the case is the same. We're all better off if we all, or enough of us, do this, But my doing it in the absence of others doing it doesn't produce the desired effect, and it harms me. Trevor concedes that the behavior and values of the three people he asks us to imagine are logically consistent, but he says the reason they're not exhibiting integrity in the relevant sense is that they're behaving in one way in the public or political sphere and in a radically different way with respect to their individual behavior. But I fail to see how this is so if the grounds on which they advocate the change at the social level do not have to do with the wrongness or the harmfulness of individual actions. However, I would once again emphasize that even if, in our three cases, the reasons were the ones that I claim don't indicate a lack of integrity, it is still true that if the individual behavior would undermine their effectiveness in advocating for the changes in rules or norms, they do have a moral reason to change their behavior. But this, of course, is a causally based reason. Thank you.
So thanks, Don and Ramona, for your comments on my book. I'm going to start timer on my other monitor here, so I know we leave time for questions. There's way more here that Don and Ramona have raised than I can possibly address in these short moments, but I'll take a stab at it. I'm going to start with Don's comments because they're a little more abstract and give me an opportunity to say a little bit about about some of the background assumptions of the book and why I structured chapter 6, which is the one about individual procreative obligations the way I did. One of the goals I had in writing the book was that I wanted to make as few controversial background assumptions as I could. And right now, in the environmental ethics literature, there is a huge controversy about how we are to understand harm in the context of a collective action problem like climate change. So as far as I have no idea which view is the majority view, the view Don is putting forward is that, well, it seems more plausible to say that your individual emissions do cause harm in the climate change case. And there are a lot of people who argue the opposite, that say that because of the causal complexity associated with what happens with your individual emissions and the fact that those bad effects of climate change are dependent on the existence of all these other emissions being up there in the atmosphere, you can't really say of any individual set of emissions that they've caused harm. Now, my own, this is a debate that I have simply never resolved for myself, but when I was putting the manuscript for the book together, I just knew I don't want my entire argument to hinge on this particular conception of harm, the affirmative claim that yes, your individual, pollution or greenhouse gas emissions or whatever the particular effect might be, that individual action does in fact causally connect to harm. I didn't want the argument to be dependent on that view because I know of so many people who disagree. And so I offered two other arguments in that chapter that don't rely on that notion of harm to try to make the argument, one of which is sort of a non-contribution principle, which I'm borrowing from Travis Reeder's book, Toward a Small Family Ethic, where he essentially says that we have a certain deontological duty to just not participate in certain kinds of systemic harms that are going on. I think he uses the phrase massive systemic harm, which he thinks climate change is one example. And the other one was the integrity argument that Don alluded to. So I think Don and I may just have fundamental disagreements about the relative value of integrity and how we are to understand it and why it's important. I want to real quick just say though that one of the functions I think that integrity serves as a virtue is serving as a check on what I will call ad hoc rationalizations for certain kinds of behaviors. So to take one example that he mentioned that I use in the book, if I were seated at a table with someone who is an animal rights activist and they were to consume a cheeseburger or a steak or something like that, despite the fact that they were constantly telling everyone we should eat less meat and we should abolish factory farming and so on, and they were to say to me, well, you see, I will take on board that commitment if everybody else abides by it. My inclination, omitting the profanity for the purposes of this talk, would be, I don't believe you. You're asking other people to make a behavioral change that you yourself do not demonstrate a willingness to make. That, why should I believe that you would actually make the sacrifice you're claiming everybody should make if you're not willing to do it yourself? You're not communicating to me that you actually take this commitment or this value seriously, or the sacrifice that it requires. So I'm not, so if you share my view of integrity, my intuitions about those cases and so on, which I wish everybody did, then, I think that argument still goes through. But if you're not, if you're more in Don's camp on this issue, then I will point you to the fallback argument that Don alluded to, which is that if you're going to publicly advocate for some kind of social change, you typically have to embody the change yourself. And if you don't, people will not take you seriously. He mentioned Al Gore's carbon emissions as being one instance. Right now, the California governor is being excoriated because he's advocating all these coronavirus restrictions, and he was, caught basically going to a lavish dinner party relatively recently where social distancing protocols and other things were not observed. And that's not a good look. So I think this is also one of the reasons where whenever I teach Peter Singer's article on giving to charity, the famous Famine, Affluence, and Morality, my students always ask how much Singer gives to charity. And I don't think they do that disingenuously. I think they want to know, like, does he actually exemplify the behavior that he wants others to follow? And they think that if the answer is no, then his standards are, unrealistic, or that they're insincere, that the arguments he's making are insincere in some way, that he doesn't really have, the values that he purports to have. So either way, I think there are multiple routes, in other words, to try to defend the integrity argument. Don is right that I've been pressed on this argument many, many times in the past, which is why there are so many responses to objections in chapter 6. But anyway, that's where I'm going to leave things with respect to what Don said. Ramona raised a bunch of questions kind of about what we ought to do to enact social change, and what can I do? Because none of us are probably in a position, as she said, to pass policies. So what are some of the things that we can do? I jotted down a few of these. There were a lot. And she also asked, how is it possible to justify having 2 children in light of the arguments that you've put forward? And I will confess here, I'll answer the second question first. I will confess here that I'm ceding a little bit of ground to people who want to have children and who have structured their lives in such a way that is a meaningful and fulfilling thing, like a life project that they want to pursue. Because to be frank, it is just not a life project that I envision myself pursuing. And so I'm having to, read literature and arguments where people have talked about this and tried to imagine, so what would it be like to adopt that as a life goal, or to adopt that as a fulfilling commitment? And I can at least imagine people saying, a person who has had a couple, say, who has had 2 children, saying as justification, well, look, it was always important to both of us that we have children, and that we don't just have an only child, that the child has siblings, and they could explain why that was valuable to them and so on. I at least want to leave open the possibility that such a story can be told. I will confess, exactly what that story looks like is something that's hard for me to imagine myself. So, and I also second Ramona's point that a lot of people seem to have children because of social pressures or expectations, or in some cases just because they wind up with an unintended pregnancy and just decide to keep the child. There are lots of people that I think this kind of life plan type explanation is they're not going to be able to genuinely provide that kind of justification. And so I do think that in a lot of situations, people will have a hard time, even on my standards, justifying the 2-child maximum. That for a lot of people, it will be, they may be, especially if you're someone who doesn't really want kids for any, if your reason for having your first child is just to get your, parents off your back on pestering you about it, I don't think that's a particularly robust reason to have children. I think in that situation, you should be willing to stand your ground and say, no, that's not what I want with my life. I think it would be, given the connection to these environmental impacts, it would be wrong for you to just have a child for that reason, given the moral gravitas that's attached to that kind of decision, not only with connection to these environmental impacts, but also with the fact that you're bringing a whole new life into existence that you're going to be responsible for. Now, as far as specific things that you can do, I think that the biggest thing that we can do as individuals is to try to sort of make it so that discussions about procreation, contraception, etc., are not under this sphere of being viewed as a private matter. For a long time, a lot of people viewed procreative choice as being beyond the pale of moral judgment. It was sort of in a privileged position where no one had the right to criticize your family size or any of that kind of stuff. But procreation is not a private choice. It affects other people. Certainly, it affects the child who's created, but it also, because that child's going to be a member of various communities, both local and national and potentially global, the child will also affect other people's welfare in various ways. So I think that anything we can do that kind of brings these kinds of decisions more out into the open, whether it's, as Ramona mentions, writing to public officials or donating to charity that works to, like donating to the UN Population Fund or other organizations that promote reproductive health and increased access to contraception. I certainly think those are good things to do. I think that trying to change, trying to make other people around you aware of the sort of moral dimensions of the decisions that they may just be casually making. I think all of those things are good to do. I'm hesitant to say which of these things might be obligatory because I feel like that's going to be very context sensitive. There are certain people who could not publicly advocate some of the ideas. All right, see, I'm out of time. There are some people who may not be in a position to publicly advocate some of these ideas without risk of social ostracism or various other kinds of really severe negative impacts on their lives. So I guess this is the kind of thing where like I would have to write a new paper or something trying to delineate exactly what is obligatory and what's just morally good to do but not required.
Well, thank you, all of you. We have about 15 minutes left for questions, and a lot of these are really great questions and could be directed to, taken up by any of you. So let me just try to jump in and summarize a couple of them. I'll say in general, it seems like there's some sympathy for the idea of addressing overpopulation directly, that might be part of a solution, but there are a lot of questions about how to do so effectively and sensitively. And so one set of questions has to do with thinking about this in kind of the context of global inequality, with a history of a colonial history, and sometimes skepticism about development efforts, and thinking of just about where the population growth is likely to come. How do you think about doing this in a sensitive way? When it might be more of the global poor countries that have a lion's share of the population growth.
Yeah, so one of the things that I stress in the book is that the most stringent obligations to curtail procreation, at least in the short term, are actually probably in countries like the United States and Western Europe, where admittedly we have in some of those countries, they do have like fairly low fertility rates, like below replacement. But the impact of reducing the US fertility rate by like half a child, like 0.5 children per woman, would be vastly, in terms of ecological benefit, would be vastly superior to, say, curbing the reproductive rate in, I don't know, a country like Malawi or something like that by, even like 2 children. The other factor here is that some of those countries that are developing, their emissions, like for thinking about CO2, are perilously low. Like they're so low that these people can't even meet like their basic needs. And there seems to be a very strong justice-oriented argument that they should be allowed, at least in the short term, to increase their emissions just to be able to meet people's basic needs. And which means that, again, like the burden of like, mitigation for climate change and things like that falls disproportionately on the developed nations that are already like grossly exceeding, whatever the sustainable amount would be. Is contextualizing this to chapter 5, I advocate in like sub-Saharan African countries and some of these other developing nations, mainly pushing for autonomy enhancing measures, the measures that simply increase women's reproductive freedom and increase their educational opportunities, because in a lot of those places, that's what would be most effective, and that's what is the least controversial thing that we could do.
Great, thank you. Does either of the other panelists want to jump in on that? Okay.
I think Trevor's answer is perfect.
Okay. So one of the other questions that we got multiple times just relates to, again, kind of sensitivities around religious communities, so that some of what was laid out here as different ways of thinking about population might be well taken by some audiences, but in front of a more religious audience potentially than is here, that these would be controversial thoughts about sex education, about contraception access, but also just about the very idea of constraining the number of children. And what recommendations do you have for how to have that kind of conversation effectively when this is a matter of public policy and it's a pluralistic society?
Well, typically your rights are curtailed to some degree by, when they negatively affect others. So we all have rights to religious freedom, but nobody has, I think, a right to like human sacrifice, even if that was something that your religion entailed, was required of you. Now that's obviously a more extreme case than what we're talking about here, but the general idea is that if you have this, we can kind of observe the impact of widespread unrestricted procreation, and it affects the welfare of other people, both present and future. And so I think there's a case to be made that a certain degree of restriction would be warranted. That being said, I would also stress like the stuff in particular, like changing, moving away from abstinence only sex education, for example, or increasing access to contraception. There isn't any like coercion involved there. That's literally just giving people more medically accurate information in one case, and in another case, just giving them an additional option for how they manage their reproductive lives. So I don't think that that's, it's not like we'd be forcing people to act on these sorts of things. The idea is, I understand that there are some people that just view these kinds of measures for whatever reason as being kind of evil. But we're not talking about coercing people into doing these sorts of things. We're just trying to give them more options or access to a greater wealth of information. I just struggle to see that as morally objectionable.
Anyone else?
Well, I would just say that I think some of these battles have to be fought within the relevant religious community. And I think that there are people in that community who can find strong religious arguments in that faith tradition for, protecting the earth as a gift from God and so forth. And we've, of course, the Old Testament says, go forth and multiply, right? But there are many things in the Old Testament that Christians have come to say that was an admonition for those times and is not appropriate anymore. So I think there are tools within at least most of the faith traditions that I'm aware of to provide a counterweight to some of the arguments that might go against the sort of policies that Trevor is proposing.
Thanks. Another question, a set of questions, is really just about, okay, so you've put this issue on the table, these possibilities, but we're just really weighing them against other ways of combating these issues, and where should we put our emphasis? So what is the relative importance of decreasing population growth versus lowering just kind of per capita impact? And do you think that is there any kind of trade-off in terms of just the time and effort we're putting into one kind of policy change versus another kind of policy change?
My basic stance on both of those things and also the more controversial geoengineering technology is basically do everything, because none of it's not going to be enough, whatever it is. So the premise behind the idea is that there's no way to solve. I don't know if that's audible, but train. Okay, well, fair enough. I gave you a warning. Earlier. So the premise behind this kind of concern is that there's no way to meet, in my view, there's no way to meet the 2 degrees Celsius goal. We're going to go over that. There's no way to prevent substantial biodiversity loss. There's no way to adequately respond to every single problem that we face. So what we have to do, but how far we overshoot on these problems matters a lot. A 4 degrees Celsius world is going to be completely catastrophic, whereas a 2.5 be a lot of harm and a lot of loss, but at least that's still going to be livable. And, you know, that's a salvageable situation, I think, whereas 4 degrees, it's looking a lot worse. And so, you know, my take is, let's look at what we can do with respect to population. There's a lot of like low-hanging fruit here. There's, you know, the possibility of preventing up to 1 million births in sub-Saharan Africa with just improved access to contraception and greater educational opportunities for women. Let's look at what we can do with respect to mitigation and adaptation that's feasible and that's easy, and let's do it all. And let's see what we can do, you know, with geoengineering that's not going to be, you know, extraordinarily dangerous or potentially make things worse. Like, put all the options on the table. Let's pursue every single one that we can. And let's just see where we end up, because I guarantee we're going to fall short of like the goals that we set, but we'll come closer to reaching them than we otherwise would. If we just focus on consumption, or we just focus on population, or we just focus on a sort of technological solution, then we're going to fall even shorter of where we might otherwise wind up.
So another question related to this was, though, what you would say in terms of your moral conclusions about having a certain number of children for individuals, how does that change, if at all, in countries where they're concerned about shrinking populations, like in Northern Europe, or, you know, for say economic reasons, they're concerned that there actually will be bad effects for their society because of declining population. How, as a practical matter, should we think about addressing that?
There's a couple of possibilities. One is allowing those countries to have a greater, to bring in more working class immigrants so that doesn't result in a global increase in population, because you're not creating any new people, but you're at least providing sort of a buffer from like the rapid shrinking of certain societies. So the ones I'm familiar with the most are like Italy and Japan, where these are really like their fertility rates are so low that they are in danger of various kinds of severe short-term economic problems. And so there is a weird tension here where like we want to shrink population, but we also, in a sense, don't want to shrink it so rapidly that the societies collapse or that everybody is made dramatically worse off. I'm not sure what the ideal like number is as far as fertility rate goes for where you get like the appropriate balance between reduction and kind of avoiding those short-term problems. But immigration is one option. The other option would be to have in certain kinds of, I don't know exactly what the standards for this would be, but have in certain countries like do more to like kind of tilt things the other way, like have in some countries engage in, pronatalist like media campaigns or things like that. Like if you got down to a fertility rate of like 1.2 or something like that, where you really are just shrinking too fast. But it's hard to know exactly how those play out without looking at them on a case-by-case basis, I think.
Great. I think we have time for just two quick questions and maybe two quick answers. So let me start with, an Ohio State graduate who actually was also your advisor, John Nolt, writes, to what extent do you really oppose the non-coercive encouragement of not having children, right? These incentives, when you talked about them, it seems to me this can be morally praiseworthy.
Yeah, I don't really oppose non-coercive encouragement of not having children. Like that's socially rare, like compared to the other case, but I don't see anything wrong with that. Especially since in the question it's specified that it's non-coercive.
So as long as it's non-coercive, yeah. Okay. Well, with just 1 minute left, there was a nice question that I think to end on, which is just whether or not you, in your book, talk about any good nonprofits that people should be thinking about or aware of that are advocating for, addressing population growth.
Yeah, that is a good question. I remember there being a couple maybe footnotes about that at the very, very end of the book. Here are like a few that I'm just like aware of. Like I mentioned the UN Population Fund. There's a Population Reference Bureau, which is a private nonprofit in the US. Let's see, there's the Population Institute. It's not that hard to find some of these, but they aren't as well known as one would like them to be. I can forward you to a site that has a compendium of these, which is if you go to overpopulation-project.com, they have a bunch of resources, and one of their web pages has a list of organizations that are working to combat overpopulation. And so if you're thinking like, well, I'd like to donate to one of these organizations, or I'd like to be, more up and up on the news about these sorts of things, like I think that's a good general website to go to, but also that particular page where they list all these organizations is something worth checking out. So that was overpopulation-project.com.
Great. Well, thank you, Trevor. That'll, for anybody who wants to keep working on this, they can go to that website and continue on. Well, I'm sorry we have to call it there. We're at 5:30, but I just want to say thank you again to Trevor for writing the book, to Ramona and to Don for participating in this panel as commentators, and again to all our friends at School of Environment and Natural Resources for co-hosting this event. We really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a good evening. Take care.